Hi, I'm John Feldt. This is the weekly water outlook for August 4th. Well, these are some of the major trends that are occurring right now across the nation. Across the Midwest, this has been an area here that has really picked up over the last month or so. We're seeing this real dry spell. Matter of fact, Des Moines for August precipitation totals was 3 inches, almost 4 inches, 3.5 inches, I should say, below normal. So that area is expanding and it's deepening, and it just looks like there has not been any significant precipitation in that area. Now, on the outskirts of that, precipitation is fairly close to normal. Chicago minus 1.48, and then we get further east into Indiana and Ohio, we start to tap into that above normal precipitation area that's occurring over parts of the eastern U.S. So if we look at soil moisture anomalies, and this briefing I put long-term ones. These start the end of May and go through the current time. So these are long-term. Sometimes I put weekly, sometimes monthly. This goes back to May, and I wanted to show some of the, sort of pull back from the short term here. And you can really see, pretty interesting here. This is the story of the summer and the growing season. We have wet anomalies of soil moisture over the east, and we have dry soil moisture anomalies here in the central part of the Midwest. Elsewhere, sort of a mixed bag, but these two areas right here are really shaping soil moisture, agriculture, with areas in that green, adequate moisture, adequate precipitation, good growing conditions, and then deteriorating growing conditions over areas in that deep red. So those are some of the key patterns that we see right now. Now, in my monthly newsletter, I did put out some information on how drought changes over the summer, and you can read that to get more detail. But I did want to point out that I found it sort of interesting to see that where drought starts during the summer doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to expand. Up here, these are the years in recent past. Most years there's been some expansion, but most of this has been fairly neutral, sort of status quo. But there have been some years where it started off in drought, and we ended up with actually additional rain or decreases in drought. And there's even less variability, or even more variability, when we're looking at severe drought. So you can read in the newsletter more about that, but I found it very interesting to say just because we're in a drought at the start of summer does not mean that it's going to end in either a greater degree of drought. Now, as we go from July to August, I wanted to show climatology here. This is rainfall climatology, normal amounts of rain in July on the left and August on the right. And generally, August tends to quiet down a bit. We have a bit less precipitation. We start to look for some of these overnight large-scale rain-producing mesoscale systems, but generally a tad less rain in August than in July. Now, from a national perspective, we can look at along the immediate coast, and we do have tropical and sea breeze interaction. But over the Midwest, generally a bit quieter in August than in July. Now, the jet stream, we've been in a very persistent jet stream pattern. Been pretty amazing how many weeks I've been talking about this with this ridge of high pressure over the west, centered over Texas, area of low pressure over the eastern U.S., and that is driving both temperature and precipitation patterns for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and it really looks like to some degree or the other over the next 3 or 4 weeks. So that's been a very persistent type pattern. Now, the tropics, I know in the Midwest we're quite far away from the tropics, but occasionally tropical moisture works up our way. And I thought I'd take a quick look at tropics, and then been pretty quiet. There is something off the coast there, but no chance of development right now. The image on the right, you might have noticed I sent something out on this. When dust blows off the coast of Africa into the tropical Atlantic, it can suppress tropical activity, and that's indeed what has occurred over the last week. So that's keeping it very quiet. And if you look here in the tropical development region, it is very quiet because of that dust layer that has pushed over there and is inhibiting tropical activity. So the last 7 days, precipitation, generally blue is not all that significant rainfall. So if we look at all of Minnesota, almost all of Wisconsin, almost all of Iowa, good parts of the Dakotas, a very quiet week. Less than a ½ inch of rain. Some areas no rain at all. These areas right here are no rain at all right in here, these blank areas. And this light blue here is very, very light amounts of rain. So a very quiet week. Now in the eastern part, a little bit more significant rainfall in a few spots. This is fairly scattered. And then a more widespread rainfall in this area right here. The most significant rainfall actually, and this was pretty extreme rainfall, was in eastern parts of Kansas where it was fairly dry. That's a lot of rain, 5 inches or more, and that purple is actually nearing an estimate of 10 inches. So the heaviest rain by far was in the eastern Kansas area and parts of southwest Missouri. So we look at the percent of normal over the last 7 days. The story for the Midwest is generally well below normal precipitation. Actually, from a widespread perspective, over the last month or so, this is the greatest I can remember as far as aerial coverage of below normal rainfall. The dark red there is 5% or less, so extremely less than normal rainfall. Now again, in Kansas, if you take a look there, look at that purple, 6 times normal for the week down in that region. So how much rain would it take to get us back into sort of perfect conditions? This gives some idea. This goes through the end of July, so it doesn't really reflect that precipitation over Kansas. So it's sort of interesting to see that much of that was erased with the recent rain. But I think generally this would give us some indication that in areas that have been dry, 3 inches of rain or so would go a long way. And we're getting some areas that are really dry more than that. But this gives some idea. I don't think this is what we need to get crop conditions back to perfect condition, but this is some idea, just brings soil moisture. We could get maybe 3 or 4 inches, not maybe 75% of this would go a long way. So we don't need all this rain to get us back to perfect growing conditions, but we do need about 75% of it. So the jet stream analysis, very little change here. This is the forecast for this upcoming week. The red dashed line is generally where pulses of energy will be moving along that track. So along that track, there could be some modest precipitation. I don't expect it to be all that significant because the energy is not that strong. And then south of that blue line is where we have what I call a thermal gradient, where the temperature goes from warmer temperatures south of the jet stream, colder to the north. That's where most of the action will be. Matter of fact, if you look at the temperature anomalies over the last 3 days, what you see here, these are blue or below normal temperatures, and oranges here are above normal. And that's why we've had the precipitations generally right along that boundary between the warm and the cooler air. And I really don't expect that to change. That pattern looks like it's going to continue through this week. That's why the heaviest rain is forecast to be generally along the very southern parts of the Midwest, Kansas again, southern Missouri, on to the east, and that's along the southern boundary of that jet stream. I think what's interesting here, we'll have to watch, is this area right in here does look like there could be some modest precipitation, and it really, really needs it in this region. Hope it works out, but I will say that the models have been very inconsistent. There has not been a whole lot of skill placing precipitation in there, so I wouldn't at this point get your hopes up for that specific area getting 2 inches of rain. But if we just get an uptick of precipitation, some modest rain in there, have to start somewhere because soils are really dry. So let's hope we get that, but like I said, the models have really not been doing all that well. Now I looked out further, actually weeks 2, 3, and 4. This is week 2. And it almost looks identical. Very little change. We see the axis of heaviest rainfalls right here along the southern edge of the jet. Some hint here at perhaps a bit more rain, but not much. It's just a little bit of different shading here. That's like your 30%, 40% probabilities. Nothing to get all that excited about. It doesn't look like it's going to end the concern with dry weather, but at least there's some chance there. Elsewhere, more modest precipitation, eastern parts of the Midwest, light up in here. This is basically the pattern we've had. I don't see much change on that. And really looking at week 3 and 4, very similar type pattern. So we really have a stagnant type system here with some modest changes here and there, but nothing real radical as far as changes. So the takeaway points for this week's briefing: action along the edge of the jet stream, perhaps a modest uptick in Midwest precipitation. Dry spots will remain, tropics are quiet, and this looks like a persistent pattern. Now, upcoming this week, the information I plan to get out today, I've sent the newsletter. Be sure to read that. I have a lot of interesting information in that. Thursday, the long-range outlook. I'll be looking at August and September. And then sector updates for agriculture and other areas throughout the week. Hey, thanks for listening to this week's briefing. I'll be talking with you again next week.